Welcome. I'm Mike Coburn. I welcome you back to our panel discussion this afternoon. I do want to remind you that you can follow us along on Twitter using the hashtag #RAForum. For those who missed the last segment, which was the Flash Talks competition, it will be available for viewing along with all 3 days of our forum content on this website, which is raforum@vfairs.com. And they'll be on the website after today. So please bookmark this page. Our next group of panelists will address the ways in which COVID-19 could have a lasting impact on the speed of patient innovations. It's a crucial and timely topic. So our moderator for the panel will be Dr. Jeff Allen, who is the president and CEO of the Friends of Cancer Research. And our panelists are Dr. Ned Braunstein, Senior Vice President, Regulatory Affairs and Pharmacovigilance and Risk Management at Regeneron, Dr. Peter Marks, the Director for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the FDA, Dr. McDonald Pritchett, the Senior Vice President at PhRMA, Rachel Sher, the Vice President of Regulatory and Government Affairs at NORD, the National Organization for Rare Diseases, and John Taylor, the President and Principal for Compliance and Regulatory Affairs at Greenleaf Health. You can pose questions using the Q&A function as part of the Zoom program here. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. I'm thrilled to join the events for the conference today and being joined by a terrific group of individuals to be part of this panel to begin to address how will COVID-19 impact the speed of patient innovation in the long term. And on behalf of the panel, I want to thank Research America and the organizers for inviting us to participate in the meetings today. So like Mike said, we'd love for this to be an interactive session, and we'll have time for Q&A with the attendees that you can enter into the Q&A function into your toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But in order to get things started, I want to start off by really addressing the short-term challenges before we jump into the long-term. I think everyone can probably make their own laundry list of how they've personally and professionally been impacted by COVID-19 so far. But I just want to go in the order that the panelists were introduced to get a sense from each of you how the sectors that you align with and represent have been affected in the last several months and how you've repositioned things. So Ned, let me start with you. As a representative from a nimble and innovative company, how quickly did you see things change, and how is Regeneron keeping up with all of the different activities that you've been leading? I think you might be on mute, Ned.
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
All right, this is a real Zoom meeting, isn't it? As I was saying, there are 4 areas that we've really had to focus on. First of all, you know, we have essential workers on site, and one of the things that we had to do is to continue being able to bring workers in and think about their safety in new ways, because we had to be able to bring people on site in ways, our essential workers, to come on site and work so safely and with confidence. And that was one of our initial challenges, to make sure we could do that, especially because we had people working on developing COVID antibodies and COVID treatments, and we needed people who could come in and do the work. So that was one of our challenges. The second challenge that I think we all had to face in our sector is, how do we ensure the safety of the patients and the continued safety of the patients in our clinical studies? We have an obligation to them, and we have to make sure that they can be adequately cared for if they can't get to an investigator site, if they're sick, if they have an adverse reaction. How do they get their drug? How can we monitor what's going on with them? Those all have required innovative approaches that we've had to deal with. You know, from a work point of view, our company was one of the first to jump into the COVID arena and do clinical studies, and we've been working quite effectively with the FDA. They've been very collaborative in helping us move the needle, originally in our anti-IL-6 studies, and now in our studies with COVID cocktail the monoclonal antibodies. And that's all been new work that we've had to take on that we hadn't planned. And then while doing all that, of course, we had to try and keep the pipeline moving forward, right? From a pharmaceutical point of view. And then do all the compliance stuff that you have to do, as a drug company. So that's, there's been a lot going on, but that's sort of how I, talk about things, prioritize.
Yeah. Thank you. Peter, on behalf of the FDA, I think most people, unless they've totally stumbled upon this session on accident, can have a pretty good sense of how your priorities have shifted. But from an FDA perspective generally, how has the agency sort of coped to remote working and dealing with normal business in addition to COVID?
Yeah, that's a great point. So thanks for the question. The agency has adapted very well to teleworking. And actually, I think the problem has been that people have been actually working too much rather than not enough. People end up working very, very long hours, in part because we have a very large workload. We have the usual freight, which is moving through the agency. And on top of that, particularly in our center, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, each of our product offices has had its own new load of COVID-related investigation of new drug applications, emergency investigation of new drug applications, inquiries. And so the workload has been really quite impressive. And I'd say the one thing that was that's just been a surprise to me is I had in March, April, May, I thought that we would get to a point over the summer where we would have adjusted, where there might have been some plateau, but there has been really very little cessation in the frenetic activity that we've had, and it's made us need to think of kind of having more of a marathon mentality than a sprint mentality, which is what we had at the beginning. So we're moving over to the marathon mentality to get us through this rather than a sprint to adjust.
Anne, you have a collaboration and insight into a lot of different companies and the industry as a whole. What observations have you had that your member companies have had to make quickly on here to adjust?
Sure. I would say that one of the challenges has been since the outbreak in China at the end of last year, we've been actively engaging with our R&D heads and our global supply chain leads on, kind of three key areas. One, ensuring continuity in our global supply chains to avoid disruptions and potential shortages. And really starting from the new year on, FDA has reached out to, I think, all of our member companies, all of the manufacturers across the biopharmaceutical sector to say, hey, are you at risk of shortage? Are you concerned about disruptions, and how do you address them? And we've had to deal with issues that I never thought would be a concern. When the travel ban happened between the US and Europe, we had to worry about the cargo capacity in passenger planes to get pharmaceutical goods back and forth. So we've had to deal with some unexpected issues. And as Ned mentioned, the issue around essential workers and the patchwork of state policies regarding who's an essential worker impacting our ability to ensure the continuity of clinical trials. So those have been kind of two areas of key focus. And then of course, more than half of our members have been very engaged in trying to move forward R&D assets related to COVID-19. And we've been doing everything we can to support them and our federal partners so that we can collectively advance the ball there.
Sounds like pretty much all aspects of business. Rachel, for patients who have in many ways had their medical care almost upended, what types of things have you been hearing from the patient community?
Yeah, the pandemic has really impacted the rare disease community in significant and pretty extensive ways, obviously. NORD's done two different surveys of the patient community, first at the beginning of the pandemic and one more recently. And the data that we have really bears that out. 39% of the participants in the survey have had challenges accessing their medical care and treatment. 74% had medical appointments canceled. The 69% were worried about shortages of PPE and the medications that they need, and 20% actually had difficulties accessing them. So, you know, for rare disease patients who absolutely need to see their providers for ongoing treatment, but also being able to get in to see providers to participate in clinical trials, et cetera, it's had a real impact. On the bright side, I think we have seen an uptick in the use of remote technologies and telemedicine, which has been something that the rare disease community has long sought. In our survey, over 80% of the respondents had been offered a visit to see their provider remotely. So that's good news. But, you know, NORD has been working not only on the telemedicine front, but in all of the areas that the rare disease community has been impacted, including looking at access to PPE, to shortages, doing a lot of work around ensuring that coverage is adequate and sustained throughout all of this. So all of the work we've been doing, this is just a sampling, is up on our website for anyone who's curious, all the statements and everything. But we've been very busy trying to sort of wrap around the rare disease community and get all of their needs met.
Thank you. John, can you round us out from the panel here and share your thoughts from what you've seen from your vantage point of working with a number of different components of the health sector?
Yeah, sure, Jeff. Thank you. So first of all, I think as some of the other speakers mentioned, our first priority was to ensure that all of our workers were working remotely and had the tools to do so. From a workforce standpoint, that obviously had a huge impact. But from a substantive work standpoint, we're a classic FDA regulatory consulting firm, and so our bread and butter work during ordinary times is, you know, to help support sponsors, research and development work, to help companies navigate the approval process, to help companies with their manufacturing quality efforts and their supply chain efforts. And so that core work continued, except the emphasis changed very radically to the COVID response efforts. And there were two particular areas that that we had to grapple with that were somewhat unusual. One is, instead of just helping clients navigate the approval process, we need to help clients navigate the EUA process as well, because our clients included therapeutic companies, medical device, diagnostic, vaccine. So especially in the device realm, there were a lot of EUAs that were sought, and so we had to learn that process. Another area in particular that was profoundly impacted, not just and that impact wasn't felt just by us, I think by some of our other peers, has to do with our part of the business that conducts regulatory audits. So we often, you know, conduct audits of manufacturing operations to ensure that they are performing with the requisite quality. And we also audit clinical trial sites to monitor the trials. Because of the pandemic, we had to learn how to perform both functions remotely. And so just like the agency, we had to change our processes and procedures to try and glean information in a way that you know, was different, but at the same time provided as much insight as possible as to whether in the context of manufacturing operations, quality operations are being conducted properly, in the context of bioresearch monitoring, whether or not the clinical trials are being conducted. And then the last area of particular of interest to us has to do with the fact that we became involved here and there in certain import related issues as more and more products move either from the United States into other markets or from other markets into the United States as part of the larger global effort to respond to the pandemic.
Thank you. So obviously this has created a significant shift to all aspects of the ecosystem here. I'm shifting a little bit into thinking about how some of these changes that have had to be adapted to might stay with us into the future. A number of you mentioned the impact on clinical trials, both to the sites and to the participants. And I remember very early on, estimates were coming out of the NCI and others of how cancer clinical trials in the spring were down some 40 to 50% in terms of participation and accrual. Peter, I wanted to start with you. I know that the FDA was very quick to issue some thoughts through guidance about flexibilities could be used. before I come back to Rachel on some of her points, could you share with us some of those recommendations and the flexibilities that you've seen that the agency has recommended to trial sponsors?
Yeah, so we've a couple things have clearly happened, which is for products that are really important for managing COVID-19. We've been very active in having upfront dialogue with those sponsors, having people have a conversation with the agency that hopefully facilitates the submission of an investigational new drug application on the first try without having to go back and do several tries. We've also been turning around submissions remarkably quickly, and that's a little bit of where I talked about a sprint versus the marathon. We were originally trying to turn things around within like days, like a few days, and it just turns out that you can't continue at that pace for the number of submissions. And so now it's more, for many of these products, is now more like a week or so. And for some products that are less urgent, we have them on the standard timelines. But the guidance that we've done has been to try to help people understand what would be appropriate for various pathways, what might be appropriate for expanded access, what might be appropriate ultimately for emergency use authorization. And so we've tried to do that. That's one set of guidance. Another set of guidance has been trying to make certain things easier that are just routine. For instance, even in the blood donation world, we moved ahead some of our donor deferral policies so that things that we might have done 6 months or 12 months from now, we did now so that they could help increase blood availability. So it's a combination of helping sponsors developing products and taking existing product areas and trying to lighten the load somewhat, or else facilitate things like blood donation, getting things done.
Yeah. And Rachel, you mentioned, and of course, NORD has long time advocated for advancements in telemedicine generally, but on the clinical trials front, do you see this current scenario instigating changes to more distributed types of, or decentralized types of trials? And how do you see that affecting a rare patient population into the future?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, for the rare disease community, the shift to telemedicine is a welcome one, when for so many of members of our community, their provider is located across the country. The ability to avoid packing up your family, traveling across the country to see that provider is just an incredible thing. So we are seeing that in the clinical trials that are being conducted now. And I have to say, around the board, we have heard all kinds of positive comments about FDA's role in jumping in, being proactive, and thinking about the types of flexibility that needs to be deployed here. And the guidances that Peter mentioned have been incredible for everyone to just see FDA's thinking on the types of modifications that can be made, and that can be made both with patient safety in mind in the midst of the pandemic, but also to the ability for the clinical trial to continue safely with robust data too. So yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing it already now. We're really hoping that it continues going forward. And these are all the types of things that are going to really help to reduce the patient burden, both within the pandemic and after, we hope.
Yeah. John, to that before and after point, when you mentioned some of the things that are being taken by a number of your collaborators around remote inspections, do you see that as something that will shift back to normal, or is the idea of remote inspections going to be how things will be conducted into the future?
Well, it's a good question, Jeff. And so just to remind everyone, last March, the agency paused on-site inspections both domestically and internationally, and both in the context of classic quality inspections and in the context of bioresearch monitoring inspections. After that activity was paused, the agency, in some cases, did mission critical inspections on a case-by-case basis. But in the vast majority of situations, the agency needed to utilize alternate approaches in order to determine the quality profile of a particular product or a particular company or facility. And so these alternative approaches included seeking inspection reports from trusted regulatory partners, either through mutual recognition or confidentiality agreements. It included seeking information from sponsor. It included making record requests of facilities and or inspected entities. And also it included enhancing activities at the border, i.e. using testing, and in some cases, putting in place import alerts to ensure that products reaching the US were indeed of the requisite quality and safe. The utilization of the record access tools is something that was enhanced in 2012 as a part of the authorizing legislation for PDUFA and MDUFA, and it provides the agency with enhanced authority to request records in advance of or in lieu of an inspection. And so this is a tool among others that the agency has been utilizing. In July, the agency announced that domestic inspections would resume in those situations where it was appropriate and safe to do so. However, soon thereafter, the additional waves of the pandemic swept the United States. So the agency in those situations, again, where domestically it was unsafe to have on-site inspections, did do some mission critical inspections, but utilized these other tools to glean quality information. And in those parts of the country, where it was safe to do so, the traditional on-site inspections were conducted. And I think what this shows is that the agency's utilization of these tools probably will continue. I think, however, the key question is this. Back in March, the duration of the pandemic was unknown, and these alternative tools were very important for the purpose of trying to continue to ensure access to critical innovator and generic medicines. However, at the end of the day, the agency does not consider the use of these other tools as being equal to an on-site inspection. And that's understandable. As good as these other tools are, they don't necessarily provide the same insight as having someone on the ground. So Jeff, in addition to these tools that the agency has been utilizing as a way to ensure the quality of products, I think they're going to need to explore one other tool, which has been talked about and I think will be under consideration, and that is the use of what are called virtual inspections, which essentially is utilization of virtual technologies to allow regulatory bodies to look into the facility so that the agency can have eyes on the manufacturing operation, something you can't do merely through a paper request. Right now, the agency only considers on-site inspections to be inspections for the purposes of the agency's decision-making regulatory functions. But I think that in the future, the agency is going to need to explore the utilization of virtual inspections and determine whether they can use those tools so that a virtual inspection indeed is equal to an on-site inspection. And I think one other reason this is important is that the agency's regulatory partners around the world are starting to look into this. MHRA in particular is starting to look into utilization of virtual inspection. So to answer your question, there have definitely been some innovative approaches utilized in the wake of the moratorium on inspections. I think that will continue with the introduction of steps to maybe look at other approaches that haven't been used to date, but would be helpful in the future in similar situations. And in the short term might be particularly helpful if the pandemic continues on for another extended period of time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Almost a hybrid approach of sorts, which could be helpful in the long run in terms of having a finite number of staffs that can conduct international inspections in particular. I want to bring in Ned and Ann into from the industry perspective. And thinking a little bit about some of the changes that may or may not stay with us from a development standpoint. Ned, you mentioned how Regeneron has been involved in numerous aspects of drug development, both COVID and non-COVID during this time. And I would imagine, particularly on the COVID side, you've seen scenarios where portions of that from a developer have had to happen almost simultaneously as opposed to sequentially. Could you give us some thoughts on what some of those might be and how long you think that could stick around?
Well, I think what I've seen is some innovative approaches on being ready to start studies. What do you need to do to be ready to start a study? We all know what that list is, but oftentimes there are scientifically alternative ways to meet the requirements on the list. When you think about the toxicology requirements, the manufacturing, requirements, and what I think what the agency has done is they've looked at, from our perspective, some of our platform approaches, and we've been able to, where scientifically appropriate, substitute some platform knowledge for some of the specific knowledge for some of the molecules, and then gather information in tandem with clinical studies using sentinel cohorts as a secondary method. Because I want to second what Peter said. I mean, in terms of that sprint mentality, we've been on the other side of that sprint mentality. And I have to tell you, we've had INDs from last document into approval move within 24 hours. Approval is the wrong word, to get the safe to proceed letter. INDs aren't actually approved in the regulations. But I think there's been this collegial approach to recognizing that it's humans versus virus, and we're all on the human team when it comes to that. But when you think about that, and you think about things like rare diseases, that same mentality could apply, right? We all have the same desire, and that is to advance therapies for patients who have needs. Like Peter said, we can't be sprinting every day, but there are some of the things that we've learned here, I think, will be applicable to other parts of drug development. And it's just a matter of keeping our eyes open and talking. I think there's been a lot of communication with the agency, and that really helps. I think back and forth. The more we understand the agency's expectations, the better we are to meet them, and the better the agency understands what the limitations are. Then they can also be more creative at suggesting alternative scientific ways that they can be satisfied that what we want to do is safe to proceed, and that we can move in a safe direction.
Yeah, I think everyone on the panel thus far has noted what sounds like a significant increase in the collaboration in a positive way directly with the FDA. Anne, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more? If that's something that you've seen across the board of an increased interaction?
Sure, I would say that FDA has been not just a convener, but also a facilitator at the outset. I mentioned the FDA's proactive outreach to all manufacturers in terms of anticipating any potential supply chain issues and looking to see how they can proactively work with us. But I think the convener role is probably, as Ned indicated, one of the most important. So the FDA has served as a regular convener of manufacturers, the key elements of the FDA, and other key agencies that are involved in combating COVID-19, everyone from BARDA to NIH to CDC. And it's provided us with a venue for open dialogue where we can talk about what are some of the problems we're facing as manufacturers, and then we can kind of jointly brainstorm on what solutions are. So it's a very collegial approach, as Ned mentioned, where we are, I've never felt that we've been more so on the same team and working toward the same goal, combating the same foe. And I think that's one of the most important and refreshing things we've seen. We've been able to bring up issues like, okay, how are we going to ensure sufficient cold storage, cold chain storage capacity when we may have multiple vaccines with different requirements? How do we ensure that there are commonly communicated protocols for the trials so that we are ensuring that we're going to have alignment in terms of what's needed to demonstrate safety and efficacy so that we could allow the trials to proceed more quickly. And I think the level of collaboration, cooperation, communication, joint problem solving approach is what has allowed the FDA to help us problem solve so that we were able to start planning for phase 3 trials as we're implementing phase 1, and so that we could start ensuring that our federal partners were working with us and supporting us on the ramping up of manufacturing. So kind of having everyone at the same table as a team, and not as a, you're being graded and you need to think about how you're going to parse your words and can we really have the frank discussion. I would say that's one of the most important outcomes that I've seen from COVID-19, and I've been working for the industry for more than 15 years, and I would say I've never seen this unprecedented level of collaboration. And as I look ahead, that's when I want to see to be the norm as we're facing some of our really tough challenges moving forward, like AMR and some of the ultra rare diseases, and coming up with the approach to cell and gene therapies.
Yeah, I just want to second that, the agency and the industry have different levels, different types of information and knowledge. We have in-depth knowledge about our processes and about our molecules, and the agency has much broader, doesn't have that type of knowledge, but they have much broader knowledge about how problems can get solved across the industry and how others may have solved them. And oftentimes, by coming together to solve problems, we each bring our different expertise to the table. We can do so much better than when it's the old, does the agency agree with our proposal to do, X, whatever.
Almost helping the industry learn from each other to some sense. It may be frequent that another company is encountering a similar challenge. Peter, I want to shift back to you with maybe a two-parter, if I could. The first around, with this intensity of collaboration that the FDA has in many ways been spearheading here, have there been any efficiencies that you've been able to identify that could be adapted into the future? Maybe that's a hard question because of the intensity of things. And then the second part of the question is, if this were to continue, what types of resource elevation would need to accompany that in order to make it possible to sustain?
Okay, well, thanks a lot. So I think I'm sure there are multiple efficiencies that people could probably think about, but the one that I have noticed is that we have found a way by necessity of getting out quality guidance in a speed that is almost an order of magnitude faster. Maybe it's not quite an order of magnitude, half an order of magnitude faster than we used to. And some of that has to do with organizing, finding ways to organize our thinking in a way, understand what compelling questions we need to answer in guidance, rather than saying, oh, let's write a guidance, and negotiating the processes in a way with some urgency through the clearance process. And so although I am sure that some people may be concerned that, I don't think we're losing a lot here by moving faster. And even if we only retain some of what we've done, we will be better off. So I think, in terms of efficiency, getting guidance moving fast is a good thing. In part for us at Center for Biologics, many of our guidances are on highly technical topics where if you take too long to write them, you have to start writing them again. And in fact, that was an experience that I've had early on at the agency, is that there were any number of guidances that I remember coming across where we realized that, oops, well, we've been trying to write them for a year, now we have to start again. Whereas if your timeline for writing a guidance is in a matter of weeks, and you think about the key things you need to say, you don't worry about writing long, flowery introductions, but just get to the point, we can possibly do that in a way that actually is beneficial. It's beneficial for us because we take less time, but it's beneficial for industry because they actually get the advice sooner that's more fresh and relevant. And the second part of your question, you know, in terms of how we would sustain this with resources, I would say that for us, we came into this pandemic in a bad place in terms of being under-resourced in certain areas. We were barely adequately resourced in vaccines, and we certainly were not adequately resourced for cell and gene therapies. And so for us to keep this up, we will need to really amp up the resources we have, because there's only so long that we can have people working 150% effort. I mean, I think it's absolutely, I can't tell you how grateful I am to everyone for putting in hours and hours above and beyond. But it does need, especially on, it's very difficult in the trenches from the reviewer level, but I also see the strain on our managers, and we need to probably, if we continue along like this, we'll probably have to amp up various levels within the organization so that people are not working as hard, because ultimately, if you keep going at kind of breakneck speed, people will burn out of this process. I mean, the wonderful thing about this is that I don't see mistakes happening because people are so diligent, but I do see people starting to show a little wear and tear around the edges.
Right. I'm going to use that kind of call to action around the resources to pivot a little bit to you know, PDUFA and policy things to some of the other panelists. Before we do that, though, Rachel, I wanted to get your sense. You know, with so much intensity being focused on, you know, the response to COVID-19, how have you seen, or have you seen, this shift the attention away from the other unmet medical needs that the rare disease community in particular are facing? Or, you know, layering this onto it has to be a significant burden.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. We did a sort of informal poll of a lot of the industry members we work with in the rare disease space to sort of get a sense from them about how their priorities have shifted. The good news is we didn't find that a lot of those clinical trials had been canceled altogether. The not as good news is that a lot of the enrollment has been delayed. You know, some of them had actually stopped actively enrolling patients at all. And very few had just been doing business as usual within those clinical trials. So I think to the extent trials have been continuing, again, back to what we've all sort of echoed, a lot of that is due in large part to FDA's activism here and really stepping in to provide, you know, guidance on how clinical trials can continue in a flexible way. But it is pretty concerning, obviously, from the rare disease perspective, where 90% of the rare diseases have no FDA-approved therapy, to think that there are delays in starts of new clinical trials. So that's been very difficult for rare disease patients. It's been very difficult for them to try to understand why, to the extent things are changing within the context of their clinical trials, that's been going on. NORD has worked closely with FDA to try to have a direct line of communication between FDA and the rare disease community. We have a webinar coming up next week that we're doing to help answer questions that the rare disease community has around that. And we've also done one where it was a smaller listening session with the Oncology Center of Excellence. So it's been great in terms of getting that information out to the patient community, but it's been a very difficult time. Lots of concern and fears that things are not going to go back to normal. So.
And do you, just as a quick follow-up, is it a concern to you to see this shift? Do you think there's been a tension that has been brought away both from the development and care side of things from rare diseases under these circumstances that will have long-term effects into the future of developing medicine?
That is definitely a concern. I think it remains to be seen whether it's going to be something that continues after the pandemic. But, you know, I think that as I said, to the extent that the trials that have been going on have been able to continue, everyone has been bending over backwards to find ways to do it. And we're just hopeful that as things hopefully get to a turning point in the pandemic, the research and funding streams that had been there pre-pandemic return to their full steam.
Yeah.
But I think it just remains to be seen. It's absolutely a concern, though.
Yeah. And I want to turn to you really quick, back to some of the issues specifically related to the user fees and the upcoming reauthorization, the processes of which were just kicked off, a couple of weeks ago, actually. From the industry standpoint, a lot of the initial priorities had been at least discussed to some extent in the pre-pandemic days. How have you seen, or do you foresee that the current scenario will shift any priorities in terms of potential PDUFA priorities into the future?
It's still a little or a little too soon to comment on how this is going to fully affect the user fee discussions. I think we're still working on our lessons learned. I think what's pleasing to see is, to the points made by Rachel, that we have seen this acceleration in terms of the use of digital health tools and how we use real world evidence. But we've also heard from Peter that there are some real resource needs moving forward. So I think this is, we need to be learning as we go, and we need to be taking all these lessons learned and see how they're going to impact these discussions. But I think it's hard to say at this point in time. We need to shift gears completely from the discussions we've been having today.
Yeah. John or Ned, do you want to add to that at all? And both areas that maybe you've seen that have had to sort of be maybe backburnered even from the last user fee reauthorization or 21st Century Cures, or things that you might foresee undergoing a priority shift into the future here?
I don't see a long term. Oh, go ahead, John.
Go ahead, Nick. Good. I'll follow you.
Yeah, I don't see I think in the short term, the priority shift in my thinking is we have a real obligation to patients who are already enrolled in our studies. And for those patients, we bend over backwards, make sure that everything is being done right. But in terms of starting new studies, we don't want to start new studies until we are confident that we can, in fact, do what's necessary to take care of those, to ensure the quality and the proper care for those patients. So, to what Rachel said, I think there has been some effect on the initiation of some studies, maybe about a quarter or a quarter and a half in some of our areas where especially maybe in the rare disease or in the oncology space, where there's a high need for patient visits and things of that nature. But I don't see a long term. I don't see that as at least from my company's point of view, I don't see that as a long term problem. We're not less interested in those areas because of however long the COVID blip is going to last. We expect to get back into those areas, and certainly we're already reinitiating studies as we better learn how we can do some of the things that we've been doing. And my other hope is that, Peter, I mean, resources is a chronic problem that we all deal with, and I know the agency is always has that issue. But my hope is that one thing is that scientists will be heroes again, and that we'll have more people interested in science as a career and less interested, in finance maybe as the answer to all of our woes.
John?
Yeah, so thank you. Jeff, I don't know if there are new issues. I think, to Ann's point, it's a little early to prognosticate regarding the concrete PDUFA proposals that we put forward. But I think that some of our clients' interests mirror some of the comments that were made at the recent PDUFA public meeting. And from that perspective, I think, there are certain areas that obviously have helped in the context of responding to the pandemic that I think would help bolster operations going forward. I mean, things like, innovative drug development and trial design, things like real world evidence, looking at advanced manufacturing, which is something that's been discussed in the past, using continuous manufacturing as an example of that. Advanced manufacturing and looking at the strengthening of the agency's ability to effectuate that, and I think has some real tangible benefits during normal times, but I think one area in particular that the pandemic highlighted is that advanced manufacturing can help possibly boost manufacturing capacity and efficiency and product quality and do so more expeditiously than the older traditional manufacturing that has been the mainstay of industry. So those are some areas in particular that are actually mentioned during the public meeting that mirror some of the interests of our clients in regards to the ongoing PDUFA discussions.
I'm going to shift for a few minutes. There's a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A before I give everyone a chance to sort of wrap up here. I think a main feature that has been discussed by all of the participants today has been collaboration, communication, and to some extent flexibility in order to deal with the situations at hand. I don't know if the other panelists can see the Q&A, so I'm going to kind of just dive in here a little bit. And Peter, this one's going to be for you. Would you mind explaining a little bit, I think a number of us have been familiar over the last several years with the flexibilities that FDA has used from a regulatory side of things in new drug development. A lot of us have not been as familiar with the emergency use side of things. Could you just give us a little bit of an overview of the EUA process and how you're envisioning that applying specifically to vaccines?
Okay, so I think I'm going to try to do this really fast. Emergency use authorization was something that was put in place to deal with major catastrophes such as COVID-19, but also chemical, radiologic, and nuclear events. And what it said was that we could use a relatively low bar to put products that may be effective into the hands of doctors to treat these conditions. Because in a normal sense, you don't have time to develop them. And the may be effective standard is very different than our usual standard, because for a normal approval of a drug or biologic, it is substantial evidence of effectiveness as demonstrated by adequate and well-controlled trials. And so for a vaccine, there's been a lot of, especially given some of the history recently with emergency use authorizations, is a vaccine going to be just the standard going to be just, may be effective, or is it going to be something else? And I think we can say unequivocally that it's not going to be a typical EUA, just may be effective. We can call it EUA plus, you can call it a little less than a BLA, but the difference is it's going to look more like, in terms of the data required, more like a BLA. What we're going to be looking for are the data on efficacy and safety and the quality manufacturing information that indicate to us that we have a product that is going to do what it's intended to do, which is prevent COVID-19. Bottom line, that means that the trials will have reached interim endpoints, probably, if not final endpoints, that would be applicable, and they have a reasonably large size safety data set that will be evaluated by FDA. It will be taken to a public advisory committee meeting so that people can see that it's looking more like a biologics license application than a typical EUA, the standard that we use for a biologics license application. And then the EUA is really being used as a way to help reduce the time that would take for a sponsor to put together the actual paperwork that one needs for us to get the type of manufacturing conformance lots. There are some very technical things that need to be done for manufacturing, which can be done later on in this case. And it also means that we don't spend the several months reviewing it. So it could potentially, with I think a very fair trade-off, get us to a vaccine to help people sooner. And by putting in safety surveillance monitoring after an approval, after an authorization, I should have said authorization, not an approval, but after an authorization, if it's an EUA, or an approval if it's a BLA, we will be able to get a good sense on whether there are any events that we have missed in terms of safety in the shorter term.
Thank you. That's very helpful. There were a number of questions coming through on that, so I thought we'd just tackle it head on. As we start to think about, rounding out, moving into the next session, I want to give everyone a chance to sort of, maybe we'll go around in the same order that we started with, just to share your thoughts on where you see things in the next 3 to 5 years. And I think that I know it's a little too early to talk specifics in terms of, policy, but just the direction that technology is heading, the speed that has been observed, even in the context of these adversities. Where do you expect the various products to be? What types of things do you think will be the lasting effects of what has had to be dealt with over the last 6 months? And what will stick with us in the next 3 to 5 years? Ned, could we start with you? I think you're still on mute.
Hey, what's gonna stick with us? I'm really hoping that from regulators and industry will find that we can work more collegially and collaboratively on projects. It doesn't always have to be. We don't always have to be at each other, so to speak, right? And I think the more we can be collaborative and collegial, I think we're going to get to solutions faster and better. I think we're going to definitely have more remote monitoring of studies. We're going to learn to do things more remotely. We're already learning that we can all work remotely, right? I think that's going to carry forward. And I think that with the industry, I'm hoping from a regulatory point of view, we're going to find remote monitoring. We're going to have remote inspections to facilitate how we can work together with the agency. I'm thinking those are things that are going to go forward. To me, I guess those jump to mind fast.
Do you see that as something that will be facilitated globally as well?
Yeah, I think so. I do. And I'm also hoping that maybe the agency and some of their partners can work more collaboratively on global inspections when it comes to things like manufacturing plants, right? Because that's going to facilitate things both from our point of view, but from their point of view.
Right.
And still maintain quality. We're not looking to cut corners, right? Nobody wants. At the end of the day, I may be a pharma executive, but I go to the drugstore and buy drugs just like everybody else. So I want my drugs to be safe and effective too. So I need a strong FDA. We all want a strong FDA. So we're all looking for ways to do things more efficiently and more effectively while maintaining that high scientific standard that the FDA maintains.
Thank you. Peter, I'm going to come back to you since you just gave a great explanation of the UA process. We'll let you maybe end on this question. But Anne, do you have some thoughts on where you foresee the industry will be in terms of a product development standpoint in 3 to 5 years?
I think I might say less the industry, but I think what we've seen is a rapid acceleration of patient-friendly approaches to healthcare, to adopt Rachel's words. So the mass acceleration of access to telemedicine and the kind of due to necessity, the expansion of use of digital health technology, et cetera, to facilitate remote assessments. So I think we're going to see a lot of that incorporated and become the standard in clinical trials and healthcare delivery moving forward. And I'm hopeful that we're going to learn a lot from this. That's going to help us deal with some of the long-standing challenges related to recruitment and retention in clinical trials, not just for the rare disease patients that Rachel represents, but across disease areas. So I think that's one of the biggest potentials and the biggest learnings that this crisis has actually, through necessity, led us to accelerate advancements in those areas. And I would just build on Ned's point about, I think that we're going to look back at this time and we're going to be recognized and applaud ourselves with the unprecedented level of collaboration and cooperation. And I think we're going to be applying that to some of the challenges that we foresee in the future, such as the scientific hurdles and challenges related to cell and gene therapies and, other new and emerging technologies that are going to emerge.
You raised an interesting point with the focus over the last several years growing significantly toward, topics and processes around patient-focused drug development. Given that the industry has sort of set itself up to be focused on that for the last several years, I I gather you think this will be warmly embraced and well facilitated, because many of the companies have already been thinking about this for quite some time.
Yes, I think most definitely patient-focused drug development and thinking about what the desired patient outcomes are really important. And I know that the FDA has convened a broad range of roundtables and workshops on this in this space. And I think that's what we hear from the patient groups. They want to be partners with us, and how do we continue to move this forward?
Rachel, any thoughts from you on where you see development particularly for rare diseases in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo a lot of the things that both Ned and Anne just mentioned. I mean, I think that we will look back on this time as a time that has really forced us to, in a very rapid way, a much more rapid way than we ever would have done absent the pandemic and urgent need for it, to really look at how to do things differently. I mean, I think people at FDA would say that, people in industry would say that. And so I think and hope that what this pandemic has done is force us to look at those. And I think all of the modifications we've been discussing here today with decentralized clinical trials and remote monitoring. One thing I will add is that there's been sort of an increase in therapies that are coming to market that can be safely administered at home in ways that I don't think we would have ever thought before. So I think all of these are directions and steps that we think and hope that from a patient perspective are going to continue. And I think we have every reason to be really optimistic that they will. I mean, it brings efficiencies to the system from a cost perspective. It helps patients. It's easier for industry. It's just a matter of, I mean, the most important thing is, as Peter has mentioned, we've got to get FDA the resources to validate and make sure that all these new tools are working and can give us products that still meet FDA's standards. So, but I think we have every reason to be optimistic about that.
Great point. John, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I echo the statements of the other speakers, but I want to amplify something Ned said. So I think one of the great things that is happening, will continue to happen, is this strengthening of the relationships among the regulatory partners around the world. And so I think this will continue to drive that, not just in the context of inspections, but in the context of all functions. And I think it will be an extra impetus to engage in additional harmonization efforts that maybe were contemplated before the pandemic, but I think in the next 3 to 5 years will come to full fruition because of the pandemic. A couple other issues, I think. I noted advanced manufacturing. It's something that Dr. Hahn has cited as being important. I think that is important for development of cell and manufacture of cell and gene therapies. And if you're talking about patient-focused manufacturing drug development, I think that's a big role there. I think it'll help with manufacturing capacity, which is something both in the vaccine and therapeutic side that we're all wrestling with, so that people have access to products. And capacity has been a long-standing issue for years. And we focus on it intensely through periods of emergency or crisis, and then we become inattentive. And I like to think that in 3 to 5 years, we'll pay more attention to it. The other issue that I wanted to note is something Peter mentioned earlier, which is the issuance of guidances. I did 2 stints at FDA. I was the head of the inspection force not long after 9/11 and the beginning of Iraq War. And there were national security issues where we would have liked to issue the operational guidance and then get comments later. And we weren't able to do so in the way that the agency is doing so now, which I think is tremendously helpful. And so I think that is another area that I hope will continue to be utilized, because to Peter's point, if it takes so long to develop and issue the guidance, it's not helpful to anyone, and therefore the benefits of that guidance are not being realized. So those are a few things in addition to the thoughtful statements that others have provided.
Great, thank you. Peter, it's always hard to go last, but any parting thoughts on where you see things in the next few years?
Yeah, no, I think everyone's really covered a lot of this. I do think the one thing that does come from this, and I'm sorry to get back into the somewhat more technical realm or the boring realm of manufacturing, but I do see that we are going to need to be thinking about how we can have a robust and flexible manufacturing technology that can adapt to not necessarily even another pandemic, but what will invariably be the next thing that comes along where we need to make something quickly that we have not been making previously. And I think, you know, John said it very well. I mean, I think things like advanced manufacturing technologies like continuous manufacturing are going to be something that we're going to need to be thinking about, as well as having capacity that we may have to find ways to work with so that we're never at a loss for fill finish capacity or never at a loss for the flexibility to be able to move very quickly into the production of either a novel vaccine or a novel therapeutic.
Well, I think we are drawing up on time, but I want to thank everyone for their terrific insights and creative thinking today, for being part of this discussion. Thanks to Research America. I certainly have the pleasure of working with all of you as friends and colleagues, so I certainly want to take the opportunity to just say thank you for all that you are doing. We really appreciate everyone's efforts, and thanks for being part of this discussion.
Well, Jeff, thank you for leading a terrific conversation, and thank you everyone on the panel for participating in the program. It's a great conversation. We're now going to take a very short 5-minute break, and we'll see you back in the auditorium at 4:15 for a panel discussion. It's the final panel discussion of the day, one that synthesizes much of what we've heard over the past 3 days to explore what's at stake and what it will take, and what can be achieved if the goal of securing a science-strong future is realized. So as this session closes out, head back to the lobby and enter the auditorium at 4:15 for the final panel of the day. Thanks again for being with us.